I want to put up this sort of axis of Putin, Trump, Tucker Carlson, because I think we have mistakenly thought that world events or tragedies or a red line or the slaughter of innocents, or as Tony Blinken says, the commission of war crimes, that these things could be defrosted, they could be put on ice. But it's clear they're not. Tucker Carlson has been amplifying Russian disinformation. March 8th, blamed America for Russia's war. March 12th, far-right embrace of the bioweapon conspiracy theory as the bombs were falling on Mariupol and other Ukrainian cities. And then on March 13th, we learned that the Kremlin feels it is essential, in the Kremlin's words, to feature Tucker Carlson. Have you ever covered one of the two American political parties associating themselves with an American adversary at a time of war?
Almost never. I still remember, Nicole, and I'm so glad you framed this the way you do. I remember one of the most conservative Republicans in the history of America, Jesse Helms, very famously saying, you know, we draw a line at the border of this country. We are not Democrats and Republicans when we leave the border of this country and we are facing against an adversary. I'm paraphrasing him there, obviously. But it's so striking because Donald Trump speaks today, or rather yesterday, in that interview with Real America's Voices Network, this uber conservative news site. He speaks of Putin as if he's just another guy that maybe has some cross feelings with the United States. In fact, he's a national security threat to our country, and he's a security threat right now to the stability of Europe. And all Americans know that, and Republicans know that. Lindsey Graham actually today said that he would not have said what Trump said about Putin. What's also really striking, again, it's really important how you focus exactly in on the most important kernel, is that Trump is once again, as he did in his campaign in 2016, soliciting foreign interference by one of our greatest, gravest enemies, essentially. When he said, we didn't know this until Robert Mueller's team investigated it, but when he said in the summer of 2016, Russia, I hope you're listening, and I hope you'll be hunting down Hillary Clinton's emails, we later learned that Russian intel operatives basically went back to work. They were at home at dinner, and they returned to the work of basically hacking and trying to hack Hillary Clinton's various servers and entry points of her computer to find those emails on an errand from the Republican presidential nominee, Donald Trump. Now this week, he's asked Russia for more information with regard to Hunter Biden, and it will be interesting to see what is produced from that solicitation.
You know, Pete Strzok, it's hard to, on a day like today, start with politics and the politics of a defeated, twice impeached ex-president. But it is impossible to cover an attempt at peace talks in Istanbul, Turkey, and cover some stunning new reporting from NBC News about Putin's information bubble without examining what we know Putin does see. We know he sees what Tucker Carlson does every night. We know he sees what Donald Trump says and does every night. We know, as Carol's talking about, that there's a call and answer to what Donald Trump calls for and what his political interests are. I wonder if you can speak to this. I hate the words like red line and tripwires because they've all been annihilated by the Trump era. But what does this represent sort of in the world of dealing with an adversary like Russia? How hamstrung are we by having the last president speaking out to, calling out to Vladimir Putin like he's some political ally at a time of war?
Well, Nicole, I think it's extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, we are in the middle of the most consequential war in Europe in 80 years. And what the NATO alliance and the United States as part of that are trying to do are walk a fine line to support Ukraine in defending against this daily Russian atrocities as part of this war, while at the same time not allowing that to escalate into a conventional war between NATO and Russia, let alone a nuclear war between NATO and Russia. And what has worked in a deterrent context for decades and decades and decades throughout the Cold War was an understanding that there was a unified front by the United States, by the rest of NATO, that if something were to escalate, it would be met by a strong response in a unified way. And what Russia always sought through its intelligence agencies, through its diplomats, was information about what NATO and the West would do were they to cross or engage in certain activities. And because of Trump saying things like this, because of Trump asking for aid, after, as you said, acknowledging that Putin was not a fan of the West and he should do this, Trump himself, the potentially presumptive Republican nominee, if he chooses to run for president in 2024, is signaling to Russia that there is not a united front, that there is some ambiguity of how the West might respond. And that ambiguity in the context of a large conventional war is extraordinarily dangerous. It sends dangerous, conflicting signals to Russia's intelligence agencies, to their diplomats, to their propaganda channels that, as you note, that Putin watches, and it brings us into a much more dangerous environment than we otherwise would already be facing.
Pete Strzok, understanding Putin's reliance on disinformation and sort of cherry picking his inputs. Can you imagine a scenario where he's not listening to his own advisors because he sees these very powerful, very visible American voices like Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump have his back?
Well, I think that's very likely the case. I mean, there is a lot of reporting from different sources that Putin's information flow is limited to Putin, both because he's in a bubble of advisors and people that he will speak to are already limited, and that secondly, a lot of those individuals are very fearful to give him information that might conflict with what he wants to believe or that will anger him. And so in that context, in an already information-limited environment, having people like Trump say things like this, having the ability of statements by Trump, by Tucker Carlson repeating it, being shown on those few Russian-controlled state media outlets that he does watch, adds to that ambiguity. And so you have a number of dangers here. It's dangerous because it gives Putin the wrong idea of the United States posture towards Russia. It's dangerous because it presents a false narrative to the Russian people through this Russian state-controlled media. And then finally, it's damaging because it can be used by Russians recognizing that there is this split within the American society of people who believe and support what Trump is saying and people who don't.
Which would also, Ben Rhodes, be disinformation. I mean, an NBC poll conducted this week shows that just 1% of Americans have a positive view of Putin. So the strategic miscalculation of thinking that America is divided on the question of whether or not we're into Vladimir Putin is disinformation on its face. 1% of Americans like him. 88% have a negative view of Vladimir Putin, but that's not the impression you would get from watching the most highly rated, most watched program on Fox News.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things about this I'd say, Nicole. The first is that Putin's aims are not necessarily to make us like him. It's to divide Americans. If you study Russian disinformation campaigns, he wants to sow division. He wants to sow chaos. He wants to weaken America's capacity to stand up against Russian aggression. And so we shouldn't be misled by bad polling for Vladimir Putin. He can still meet his objectives if he's sowing this kind of chaos and he's able to communicate to his people, hey, look, the former president and possible future president of the United States feels like I have some leverage over him, feels like I'm the one who's doing him favors, right? That's reinforcing his position at home and while also presenting a United States that is not standing up with the united front. I think the second thing here is that there's an awkward reality that they're also ideological fellow travelers in a lot of ways here. When you look at Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, I'd point to Viktor Orban in Hungary, who has an election coming up on Sunday. Viktor Orban has been at the vanguard of this right-wing ethno-nationalist trend in the West. He's been a buddy of Putin's. He was over there before the war. He's been an outlier on sanctions within the European Union and NATO. Endorsed in his re-election by Donald Trump. Tucker Carlson has flown out there to do shows in Budapest. There is something about the ideology that Vladimir Putin represents that does find fellow travelers and very powerful voices on the American right. And it's not enough for people like Lindsey Graham to say they don't agree with that comment. Donald Trump is the de facto leader of the Republican Party. And unless and until Republicans renounce that and cut ties with this garbage, not only is it going to service Russian disinformation, it's going to allow that ideology to continue to gain inroads here in the United States, where it has no place in what is truly a battle between democracy and autocracy, we better get on the right side of that battle.
Well, I mean, Ben Rhodes, do we talk about that as though it's an open question? Hasn't the parties picked sides in that battle? Don't we have all but 2 Republicans on the side of overturning an American election result that a lifelong Republican said was the most secure in our history? I mean, hasn't that question been answered already?
I think it has. And here's the problem, Nicole, is a lot of Republicans will say, look how we've responded to this invasion. We've not echoed Trump's line. We've stood up to Vladimir Putin. We've backed President Zelensky. Sure. But what are they going to do when Donald Trump is the potential nominee of the party? What are they going to do when they're asked questions about whether or not they'll support Donald Trump? That's when they run for the hills. And that's not going to cut it, Nicole. That is not good enough. You can't say that you're on the side of the Ukrainian people, that you're against the atrocities that we're seeing in Mariupol, while then also deferring to someone as the de facto leader of your party who's basically providing propaganda for Vladimir Putin, or try to beg to get on the television show of Tucker Carlson because it allows you to speak to his base, when in fact what you're doing is going on a show that regularly airs on Russian television because it is such effective propaganda for the Russian government here. It's not enough to say you're against Putin if you also fall in line with the likes of Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. And that is the crisis that continues to be at the center of both American democracy and in particularly the Republican Party.